everybody to this webinar. This webinar is about a new guidebook, a guidebook on state obligations for conflict-related sexual violence. I think it's developed by the Mukwege Foundation, as you see. It's a very practical tool for legal advisors, but also for humanitarian professionals, and I think many others of international NGOs and local NGOs, probably many more. And when I'm correct, this is only step one, the guidebook, because something else will follow. That will be a handbook, a much more practical tool for ordinary users. But for the specialists, for the experts, the guidebook is already there. And I'm really very glad that we have two experts to explain us more about the guidebook. Very welcome, Erin and Luca. I'll introduce you later a little bit better. We have a lot of people in the room, and there's a lot of expertise in the room, I think, from the NGO side, from the academic side. So I hope you really will join us with your questions, with your remarks. Feel free to join the conversation. Since we have a limited number of participants, you are free to join the panel, so we make it into a little bit more like a video conference. If you want to do so, just say it in the chat. We move you to the panel so you can join the conversation as a panelist. We are recording this session. I think we will use it mainly to make a short video of the introductions. If you don't want to be in the video, just say so. We will check with everybody who is in the video or might be in the video beforehand, before we publish anything, if they are okay with it. What are we going to do the next 45, 60 minutes? We will have a very thorough introduction by the Mukwege Foundation. Aaron Rosenberg, Senior Legal and Policy Advisor of the Mukwege Foundation, and Luca Caroli, the legal researcher of the Mukwege Foundation. They were both very much involved in developing this guidebook. They will share all about the reasoning behind the guidebook and how you can use it. For opening up the conversations, we asked a specialist from the KUNO network to take already a brief look into the guidebook. Graciela van der Poel, Senior Humanitarian Officer and specialized in gender equality and gender-based violence in emergencies. She is working for Plan International Netherlands, and she will kick off the discussion with some first reflection and questions. And after that, of course, we open up the discussions for everybody else. We have a lot of expertise in the room. I don't want to lose too much time in the conversation, but I really would like you to share maybe your organization or where you're based, your special interest in this topic or your special expertise on this subject in the chat, so we get a little bit of a feeling who is in the room. I think this is for me so far, and I really would like to give the floor to Aaron and Luca. Please take over from here, Aaron.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here with KUNO and all of the really impressive attendees of this presentation. If I could just ask Peter if you can confirm that you can see and all the participants can see the PowerPoint presentation.
I see the PowerPoint presentation, but also a little on the side, the next slides. I don't know whether you would like to, but we can see also the PowerPoint presentation. Maybe you can enlarge the slides. At the bottom, there's this little square. It's very okay like this already.
Okay, why don't we, to not lose time, we will just leave it like that. I apologize for my sharing ineptitude. So again, it's really a pleasure to be here. As Peter mentioned, I am the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor of the Mukwege Foundation. With me is my colleague, Luca Caroli, who is the legal researcher. Luca and I are the team, essentially, that developed and created the guidebook. So to begin with, as I realize that everyone here is quite experienced and expert in CRSV, I'm going to move fairly briefly through this. But as you heard, the guidebook's title is, of course, the Guidebook on State Obligations for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. And one of the things that the Mukwege Foundation, as an organization dedicated to the eradication of conflict-related sexual violence worldwide, is very aware of is the fact that conflict-related sexual violence as an issue, its prohibition, and the response to conflict-related sexual violence has had a number of important advances. It is a much more visible topic, and it has been addressed through a number of high-profile events, we have seen developments in the law, not only at the International Criminal Court with the Rome Statute, but even more recently with the ICJ, and a number of very interesting developments, encouraging developments, recognizing the incredible harm of conflict-related sexual violence and its relationship to, for example, underlying acts under the Genocide Convention. We know that our human rights treaty bodies have continued to develop impressive jurisprudence, both at the international level, but also at the regional level, in terms of what the obligations are, not only in terms of the more critical but limited aspect of justice and accountability, but also in terms of prevention, response, and importantly, reparations. Finally, of course, the Mukwege Foundation, as the Mukwege Foundation, was very pleased at the recognition of efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence in terms of the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to Dr. Mukwege and Nadia Murad, who is a Yazidi survivor, as I'm sure you're all very familiar, and has led work on developing another tool that the Mukwege Foundation uses quite frequently, the Murad Code. And I'm sure as humanitarian actors, you have all been involved with looking at the best practices in terms of survivor engagement as set out in the Murad Code. So that is all to say that we recognize and are encouraged by the developments over the past several decades in terms of responding to conflict-related sexual violence. And yet, we also are gravely concerned by the fact that despite all of this activity, conflict-related sexual violence continues to occur throughout the world. And it continues to occur, quite frankly, more as the norm in conflicts than as an exception. Beyond that, we also are deeply concerned by the fact that prevention and response activities by states, and here I mean not only the affected state itself, but third-party states, continue to be lacking. And finally, of course, impunity in terms of justice and accountability does continue to be the norm in most of the situations where conflict-related sexual violence occurs. Of course, I will just mention very briefly, I spent a decade working at the International Criminal Court, and I think it's important to acknowledge that in terms of the ability of the court to prosecute and hold to account, that to date this has related only to non-state actors. And so while there is impressive jurisprudence, when it comes to accountability and responsibility of states, we see a continued gap. So what is the Red Line Initiative? In 2021, Dr. Mukwege called for bold and new thinking to finally take meaningful steps to end conflict-related sexual violence. The Red Line Initiative is rooted in the belief, as you can see here, that sexual violence in conflict has to be prevented and prioritized as a wholly unacceptable tactic of war, that it can no longer be tolerated. So we have 3 lines of work: evoking a clear moral rejection and outcry, strengthening and clarifying legal obligations, and third, building political will. The Guidebook is the first project of the Red Line Initiative, and it relates, as I'm sure you can see, to the second activity stream of the Red Line Initiative as an overall project, strengthening and clarifying the legal obligations on states. So we had a number of different thoughts as we began our process. And this is to give you just a little bit of understanding of why we came up with the Guidebook. So one of our first thoughts was, well, what about potentially a standalone convention, similar to the Convention Against Torture, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, etc. What about a convention on CRSV? So we undertook a great deal of desk research. We held conferences and expert roundtables. And what we concluded was that the treaty process itself is both long, but also because ultimately the final decision rests with states itself, that the outcome of the strength of any treaty was unclear, that it would actually result in a meaningful improvement. But what we also discovered was that there is indeed, as you all know, a quite robust existing set of obligations related to conflict-related sexual violence. However, because they are not contained in one comprehensive document and are rather spread out, and as I'm sure you all know, working with the UN system, are spread out in fairly inaccessible and not easy to find documents that oftentimes have titles and names where for an average researcher or person interested in the topic, it's quite easy to miss important developments in jurisprudence. And finally, the other thing that our research did identify is that while there is a robust set of legal obligations, one of the clear gaps is on implementation and enforcement of those obligations, and that there is a clear space between the international obligations accepted by states and that being reflected within their domestic legislation through the domestication process. And finally, just to point out, and Luca will go into more detail about this, of course, is that when I say that conflict-related sexual violence is actually addressed in a number of different treaties, as you are well aware, conflict-related sexual violence, of course, can be legally classified and addressed as a number of other international crimes. So as I already mentioned, for example, under the Genocide Convention, it can be classified as an underlying act. It can be classified as an act of torture. It can, based on its intent and motivation, be also recognized as a form of racial discrimination, and it can be a manifestation of discrimination against women under CEDAW. So based on all of this research and what our conclusions were, what we decided was, rather than to begin a very lengthy, potentially decades-long process of trying to create an international convention, that what would be more helpful would be to create a guidebook, essentially addressing the issue that currently, while there is robust jurisprudence and obligations, they are really dispersed throughout different international conventions, resolutions, decisions of the treaty bodies, etc. And so our idea was to essentially compile this information, the current existing obligations. One thing I want to be really clear about is that the guidebook is meant to be descriptive. It is not meant to promote any change in the law. The Mukwege Foundation does have views about, of course, areas where we would like to see strengthening of the law itself, but that is not what the guidebook is. The guidebook is meant to set out the current existing law, to serve as an information base of what the current status is, and not promote any particular interpretation or push for new developments in the law. We worked very, very closely with a number of expert bodies in order to ensure the credibility and reliability of the guidebook as a tool. What that means is, for example, the chapter on international humanitarian law was fully reviewed and commented on by the ICRC. We worked with the secretariats of all of the human rights treaty bodies and were able to receive extensive feedback and review on each of those chapters. So we worked with the Committee on the Convention Against Torture, the Committee for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, etc. And we also worked with the Office of SRSG Pramila Patton, the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict on the UN system chapter. So we did all of this, just to be clear. I realize I'm speaking to experts, fully equal colleagues, that we don't want to give the impression that the Mukwege Foundation is some sort of expert above all on this topic. We took a very collaborative approach to ensure that the guidebook is not the view of the Mukwege Foundation, but is the view of the current law as reviewed and essentially agreed to by those expert bodies that are most responsible for the promulgation of the jurisprudence in the guidebook itself. So the guidebook covers, and my colleague Luca will be taking over in just 1 second and will show you all of this, but just to give you a very brief introduction, it covers international humanitarian law, international human rights law at the international and regional level, and the UN system mechanisms and bodies relevant to conflict-related sexual violence. And for each area, it covers how how conflict-related sexual violence is defined, what the legal instruments are that bind states, and how the obligations set out in those instruments are monitored regarding the various enforcement mechanisms that do exist under each of these 3 legal frameworks. It covers 4 thematic areas: prevention, justice and accountability, humanitarian response, and reparations. Now, before I move to the next slide and hand over to Luca, I do just want to be clear that while we worked very closely in a very collaborative manner with a number of expert bodies, the guidebook was written and created by the Mukwege Foundation. And so any errors or things that maybe are inelegantly stated are completely the error of the Mukwege Foundation and not any of those expert bodies that I just mentioned. So, who is our audience of the guidebook? States, civil society, and last but certainly not least, indeed, most importantly, survivors themselves, survivor groups, and survivor networks. The guidebook's aim is to aid states. So states as an audience is meant to help states better understand their current obligations. And second, in terms of civil society and survivor groups, it is to, yes, also help those organizations better understand states' obligations, but also importantly as a tool to strengthen their capacities in asserting their rights in exchanges with states and to be able to support their advocacy efforts in holding states accountable for the legal obligations that currently exist and which states have already agreed to. So with that, I am going to that background. I don't see, let me just check the chat. Nope, looks like we're good. I am now going to stop sharing because my colleague, sorry, I think I'm probably sharing the chat with you guys. My colleague Luca is now going to take over and will be sharing the guidebook itself, not a PowerPoint. Luca?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erin. And let me share the screen right now. Hopefully it works. Is it working? Can you see it fine?
I can see it.
Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. And I'll show you the current website for the guidebook. So the guidebook, as you can see, perhaps here at the top, contains 7 chapters. I'm at this moment on the home chapter, where you can find a foreword from Dr. Dennis Mukwege. And you can also find background on the guidebook project, and finally contact information for the Mukwege Foundation. You have the table of contents to the right for each chapter, which is very convenient and can lead you directly to different headings. The next chapter deals with the introduction to the guidebook. It provides an overview of the project, including its methodology and scope, and our approach to defining CRSV in accordance with the relevant international legal provisions. But as Erin mentioned, even though we do have our own approach, it is fundamentally in accordance, like I said, with the international law relevant at this time, and does not offer a more progressive understanding of what CRSV means and what the measures required are to address it. But it must be said, the current law is quite progressive. I would say more so than maybe the average person might expect. So much so that we were able to write a section on the ways in which the law can accommodate an intersectional understanding of how you're supposed to help victims, survivors of CRSV. Chapters 3 to 5, which are the chapters dealing with the substance of the guidebook, the state's obligation to prevent and respond to CRSV, meaning international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and UN peace and security, are chapters that deal with the ways in which states must prevent, like I said, respond, or just address it generally. International humanitarian law covers, for the most part, the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols of 1977, customary IHL, and other IHL obligations. International human rights law, as mentioned by Aaron, focuses both on its international parts, but also at the regional level. At the international level, you can see our focus was mostly on those core treaties that deal the most extensively with sexual violence. And at the regional level, you can see we discussed the African Union system, the Council of Europe, and finally the Inter-American human rights system. Now, our choice was mostly due to the enforcement machinery that those systems possess, and it's not meant to overshadow the impact of perhaps other regional systems or initiatives that have addressed in their own way CRSV. Our research, in a way, was constricted also by the amount of relevant material on CRSV. So that influenced our decision as well. Chapter 5, we called it UN Peace and Security, deals specifically, for the most part, with resolutions of the Security Council. And that's because of its lead and binding role in addressing CRSV. But this chapter also includes resolutions of the General Assembly and material from the Office of the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict. Now, let me show this to you in more detail. Chapters 3 to 5 contain 3 sections. An introduction, as you can see here under the table of contents, which provides a general overview of the relevant legal system. You can find the legal framework, which lists the main treaties and other materials specific to that legal system on which our research was based. And finally, you have the 3rd section, the obligations, which details the state obligations to address CRSV under a specific framework. But moving back to the introduction to those chapters. Now, while we provide a general definition of CRSV in the introduction to the guidebook, the introduction sections of chapters 3 to 5 in their own way serve as an essential tool to understand how a framework prohibits CRSV. Now, for example, here, this is the chapter on international humanitarian law. You can see that CRSV is defined in more detail. Under IHL, CRSV must not only consist of an act of sexual violence prohibited under the Geneva Conventions or customary IHL, but it also requires a link to an armed conflict. Now, this can get complicated because I'm sure you all know the existence of a conflict can be in question, meaning the question of whether CRSV has happened is also complicated. The matter is, I would say, a little more simple, so to speak, under international human rights law. And that's because under IHRL, CRSV does not require a link to the conflict to be prohibited. Sexual violence as a whole is not permitted at any time or anywhere. However, most of the treaties analyzed here under human rights law do not expressly mention CRSV or sexual violence generally. Instead, as mentioned by Aaron, they prohibit it by making it fall under the acts that the treaties themselves proscribe in their text. So for example, looking at the chapter on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, you can see that the convention prohibits CRSV as long as that particular instance amounts to a form of racial discrimination. And that also happens, for example, under the Convention Against Torture, meaning CRSV to fall under that convention would have to amount to either torture or ill treatment. And the same applies to the other treaties analyzed in the chapter on human rights law. But going into more detail on the obligations, which really are the crux of the guidebook, as already mentioned, the obligations are divided into 4 categories, 4 themes, and those are prevention, which refers to the actions that states must take to prevent CRSV and its reoccurrence, justice and accountability, which concerns the steps required to investigate or prosecute perpetrators of CRSV and hold states accountable for violations of their international obligations, as well as to make all justice avenues accessible to victims and survivors. Humanitarian response, as you can see here, refers to what states, not the actions of humanitarians, but states must immediately do to alleviate the suffering of victims, survivors of CRSV, and allow their recovery in an environment that prevents and avoids revictimization. And finally, reparations, which is meant to be interpreted as the substantive component of redress, meaning restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantees of non-repetition, and so on. Now, looking at the obligations you can see on the screen right now, each of them has expandable text, which provides the reader with a detailed explanation on what a state is supposed to be doing. Now, given our audience today, I thought it best to focus specifically on humanitarian response, and maybe we can take a look right now at the one under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, if you were to ask yourself, for example, what wartime rape that results in the birth of a child, what kind of measures may be required for a state to adopt, then you would just have to look at the humanitarian response section and read what the content of its obligation is. Under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and you can see right here under Article 39, states must take all kinds of appropriate measure to promote the physical and psychological recovery and social reintegration of child victims, survivors. But what kind of measures exactly are necessary under this kind of general provision? And the approach we are taking in such cases is to contextualize that provision and show to readers, to people, how the provision might apply, for example, to, say, adolescents. And you can see it here, the subtitled subsection, or perhaps to the issue of HIV and AIDS in children, on birth registration, perhaps, and finally to children born of rape. So what are states supposed to do in such a case? Well, states, given the also requirements of humanitarian response as a whole, have to take a variety of extensive and very positive measures, including providing those children with equal access to vocational training, to life skills and socioeconomic support, sports and leisure activities, psychological support and counseling, safe and secure housing, and so much more. Every source, every statement is backed by footnotes, or at least as much as we could. You just have to click on the number and it will take you directly to the source here at the bottom of the page. You can see we have a lot of footnotes, and it's there's even more in other chapters. And those will take you directly to the link. The link itself will take you directly to the UN database and other databases, depending on what kind of system you're consulting. Now, Moving on to the next two and final chapters, we have ratification and enforcement of treaties, chapter 6. In this chapter, you can explore the available mechanisms of enforcement of state obligations at the international level, and also the ratification status of treaties by country, including whether a country has deposited any reservations or declarations to a treaty, as well as whether it has ratified protocols to the treaty, and whether it has recognized the competence of an expert treaty committee to hear, say, interstate disputes, maybe individual complaints, or even to conduct inquiries into violations of the concerned treaty. We were as extensive as we could be to show perhaps a survivor reading a guidebook what their options for justice and accountability may be. And we did so in as much of as accessible a language as possible. Finally, the last chapter, further readings. Well, it's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? In this chapter, you can find a thematic library of articles, blogs, and reports by NGOs, experts, academics, civil society organizations, that all provide in-depth examination of specific topics relevant to CRSV. At any rate, this is it for the tour of the Guidebook's website. Thank you very much for listening, and I will let my colleague Erin continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Luca. We go back to Erin?
Yes.
Thank you, Luca. And I'm just checking the chat to make sure. No, it's like.
There were no specific questions on the guidebook yet in the chat. I really invite everybody to take the opportunity.
So maybe just to close out, and is that okay? So just to close out what Luca has talked about, it is to share with you a little bit what we've been doing since we finished creating the guidebook. So the guidebook has been, it was completed in April of 2023, and we've held 3 different launches. The first focused on the international humanitarian law and international human rights law system, so appropriately placed in Geneva. The second was in New York during the UN Security Council open debate on CRSV, where we were joined by the Office of the SRSG and UN Women for the launch of the guidebook. At that launch, the guidebook, a special edition of the guidebook specific to the UN Security Council, was created and was presented by the United Kingdom, which was held the role at the time as president of the UN Security Council, to all Security Council members. And finally, this past December, we held our 3rd launch in Nairobi, Kenya, focusing on the African Charter and African human rights system. A little bit of the how the guidebook has been received. I'm not going to read these to you, but as you can see from, we have Pramila Patton, Nadine Tunasi, who is a survivor of torture. So this is just to give you a little sense of what the reaction has been to the guidebook. And we are very, very happy with the approach that we took and the reaction that we've gotten, which we think is very much interrelated, of ensuring that this is something that other experts, other organizations committed to this issue feel confident and comfortable recommending for use, because that's what we truly want, is for this to be used and for it to be able to assist those working side by side with us and with survivors to make a difference. So what are the next steps? We are right now right in the middle of what we call phase 2. So after the guidebook was completed, we are spending this sort of 6-month period or 7-month period, really trying to make the guidebook and the website where it is hosted much more accessible. So in just several months, there will be a new website that will have French language version, Spanish language version, a new search engine that will have keywords as well as open text searchability, and we'll have a number of accessibility features for example, persons with visual impairments, but also a number of other, we are working with an IT specialist who focuses on disability rights. So just to give one example of the scope of the type of accessibility that we are trying to address, there is, for example, a font that can be used for persons who have dyslexia, which is something that I didn't know about, but by working with these web specialists, we really hope that the guidebook is accessible to all persons who are interested, and that they can use it easily. Once the translations are done, once the other language versions are done, which we consider to be key in terms of this actually being able to be used and deployed in countries where conflict-related sexual violence is an issue. So once that is done, what we will be doing is really what the sort of vision and end goal of the guidebook itself is, that we don't want it to be just something that sits up on the web, that is just there in online space. We want it to be a tool from which other tools can be created. So we will be running workshops, creating a number of training modules, and other learning tools based on the material in the guidebook, and working in countries with national civil society and survivor groups themselves. The goal of these workshops is, one, to provide information so that they're aware of the obligations that the states that they are concerned with, what those obligations are in terms of conflict-related sexual violence, but also to work with outside facilitators to help civil society and survivor groups think about how they can develop advocacy campaigns that will push states or the international community to meet the obligations to which they are already bound. With that, the guidebook, what Luca was showing you is, here you can see is where the guidebook can be found, this guidebook.netify .app. However, as I mentioned, what we're doing right now is creating a brand new website, which is ncrsv.org. You can find the guidebook on ncrsv.org along with SEMA, which is the global network of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, which is supported by the Mukwege Foundation. There you can also find at ncrsv.org their call to action, which sets out the key priorities of the SEMA survivor group itself in terms of what type of actions they are looking for from states and what type of support they're looking for from civil society and other actors. And with that, I have concluded my presentation, and so Luca and I are really looking forward to hearing Gracielle, and I know a number of other people who hopefully have questions or comments for us. So with that, thank you very much for your time and attention, and we look forward to this discussion with you.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much. And thank you, Luca, for this really impressive work. A very thorough inventory of standing law, which can be used and is there to use, which can be supportive in the battle against sexual violence, and maybe for other issues as well, like advocacy. Very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that Graciela took the time to take already a look into the handbook, to the guidebook. Graciela, are you ready to give your first impressions and perhaps share some questions?
Of course. And I'm very humbled to have to do this. I mean, you shared such level expertise as well, and I know among the list of participants in this meeting, There's a lot of expertise. So perhaps let me start with stimulating some general reflections. You've covered quite a bit of this already. And so I just want to open that space for us to reflect together and to also get more insights from what you just shared. So thank you very much, Erin. Thank you, Luca. This presentation and guidebook is very clear in terms of communicating that sexual violence and conflict and as a method of warfare represents a violation of our shared humanity, that it can no longer be accepted as an inevitable consequence of war, but must be seen as a total and unacceptable method that no longer has place in modern armed conflicts. The guide in itself also makes emphasis to the obligations to prevent, respond to, and end conflict-related sexual violence, serving as an aid for states to stop and eliminate the use of sexual violence in conflict. And what was very clear to me from your presentation was that there's indeed a robust set of obligations, but there is a gap in their implementation, and that there's also persistent fragmentations in existing international legal frameworks that are relevant to conflict-related sexual violence. So my question, from your perspective, and you've already touched upon it, but I'm very curious to hear from you, what is that one key gap that drew your attention the most, that impacts the state's ability and also willingness to fulfill their international obligation, but if respected, would bring significant progress to end conflict-related sexual violence? You mentioned already quite a bit of this, but if you could just go that one step and that one that took your attention the most. Over, and I'll share the question, the second question after.
Well, thank you.
Xavier. Yeah, go, Erin, go. Interesting.
So I think that's a fantastic question. It's also a very personal question because I think for each person, depending on where you approach CRSV, how you engage with it, it will be different of what grabs you. As I mentioned before, I worked for a decade at the International Criminal Court, and when I started my legal career, I believed very, very strongly that criminal accountability at the international level, as a last resort where states were, unable or unwilling, was key in terms of seeing real progress at the international level. I love the International Criminal Court, love my former colleagues, have tremendous respect for what they do, but the truth is, and I will be very honest about this, that after a decade working at the International Criminal Court, my conclusion was that rather than that justice and accountability ultimately is reactive, and that when we are so consumed with responding, we forget that indeed what we're responding to is something that actually is so harmful, it really can't be repaired in a true, meaningful, comprehensive sense. The devastation caused by conflict-related sexual violence, caused by international crimes more broadly, is something that, to me, in terms of having worked at the court, but also directly with survivors with the Trust Fund for Victims, which is where I was at the court, led me to the conclusion that if we are serious about repair, we need to recognize that what cannot be repaired cannot be broken. And that means that prevention has to be the #1 priority. And that is where I see the single largest gap in terms of states specifically not meeting their obligations.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that special emphasis that you also make on prevention. And this leads me to my next question, in fact. In addition to serving as an aid for states, the guide, from what I learned, is also aiming to raise awareness and strengthen the capacity of civil society, including survivor movements, in asserting their rights and to support their advocacy efforts to hold states accountable. You mentioned that the guide was prepared in consultation process with active engagement, and you also shared the next steps that you envision slightly, and also in your personal reflection with the focus on prevention. We know, though, that civil society, but particularly women's rights organizations, women-led organizations, including survivor movements, of course, have been leading advocacy efforts, not to mention prevention and response efforts in all kinds of gender-based violence, but also in conflict-related sexual violence, before conflict, during a conflict, and after. Yet it's also commonly known that they're often sidelined and their expertise, their capacity, but also their lived experience in conflict is often ignored. So it is not for nothing that we also speak of women's meaningful participation in negotiations of peace, implementation of peace agreements, for example, or in the humanitarian settings where their agenda is often deemed as too political, with reference to the humanitarian standards. But we also know that their engagement actually strengthens response efforts. So my question, noting that this guide is meant to support the advocacy efforts to hold states accountable, as a general reflection, perhaps again a personal question, how do you envision that this guide will serve to increase recognition for women's expertise and lived experience of conflict? And what role do you see for international organizations, many of those among us in this call? Over.
Well, thank you for another excellent question. In presenting the background and what the impetus or inspiration of the guidebook was, due to the time constraint, I actually didn't address what goes directly to your question. So in 2021, we had our first global SEMA retreat following COVID. We were finally able to do it again. And what came out of that retreat was a request from the SEMA membership that we focus more on state responsibilities rather than individual criminal liability. So, and they also asked us to help them develop the call to action. So I mentioned the call to action, but the guidebook is actually meant to and directly inspired by SEMA's work and in terms of identifying what their priorities are. And again, SEMA is a global network of survivors. So in that sense, for us, while this is a sort of a technical, very legal-based document, it comes from the, as you precisely say, lived experience of survivors experiencing specifically, for example, the lack of help and assistance to recover and rebuild their lives. For many of the SEMA members, as I'm sure all of you in the humanitarian sector deal with on a regular basis, we are talking about survivors who suffered sexual violence in many cases more than a decade ago and are still fighting for support from their governments. And that includes even simply things as very necessary as medical treatment. So this is for us something that the guidebook very interestingly matches with, which is that many of the requests of survivors in their call to action, and this is something we've talked a lot about with SEMA, are actually not requests in a sense, because they're actually things that states are legally obligated to do. And so it is not that what we want, and what SEMA has said to us is that they want to be able to say to a state, not I ask you to do this, but you are required to do this. We demand that you do what you are obligated to do. And that is very different, because the power dynamic in terms of how a survivor interacts with the government is always going to be unbalanced. And so it is meant to address that power imbalance in a certain degree to provide survivors with the ability to speak about holding states to account rather than asking for something, because it is actually their right what they are addressing to states. So I think, sorry that this is a bit of a long answer, but for us, the role of survivors is critical at all stages: prevention, justice and accountability, humanitarian response. And as you point out, and this is a big part of what the guidebook is about ultimately, is that conflict-related sexual violence is a subset, right? It's a subset of sexual violence, it's a subset of gender-based violence, and ultimately gender-based discrimination, not even necessarily violence specifically. And so in terms of how we address the root causes, how we think about prevention, it's so important, as you highlighted, to not think about conflict-related sexual violence in this isolated, fragmented way, but to think about how women are engaged in peace processes, how they're engaged with demobilization efforts, all of which is much broader. And so I'm really glad that you asked this way, because it's really necessary that to have meaningful change, conflict-related sexual violence not be defined in such a narrow way that we are only responding when it fits that exact definition, but to understand that it is, as I said, a subset of a much broader set of issues affecting not just women, also men, also persons with various identities, and that all of that has to be addressed in a systematic way, that we look at really changing the social norms that permit the current environment where conflict-related sexual violence continues to occur. And so I guess that's maybe just to close, when you said, you know, what would we like to see from the humanitarian sector? It is that really sort of broad-based intersectional awareness, to really be aware of how conflict-related sexual violence and how survivors of conflict-related sexual violence may in fact be a part of a different program, if you will, and how we can integrate mainstream addressing these issues together, rather than in this very isolated, fragmented, where does it fit way. And that is not a criticism of the humanitarian sector, but it is an acknowledgement of the donor environment, and I think a lot of the international programming generally.
Thank you.
very
Thank
much,
you, Erin.
Over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Graciela, for this beautiful questions, touching upon whole new dimensions of this webinar. Thank you so much, Graciela. I don't see any questions in the chat. I only have one question, but please, if I'm understood right, I understood that this guidebook is very thorough and very, very broad and very, it's in total inventory of what's possible. I can imagine for local organizations or survivors, it might be also a little bit overwhelming. And you touched upon on the issue that you're making it a little bit more friendly, user-friendly. And maybe you can explain a little bit what the next step is to make it more user-friendly, and how you would like to bring it to these other potential users of the book. So the local organizations or the survivor groups or survivors.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted there. Luca, do you want to?
Yeah, happily. So one of the ways in which we're making the guidebook more accessible is a document we're working on at this very moment. Unofficially, it's called the synthesis document. We're trying to find a more accessible title for it. We're still brainstorming, I would say. But the document essentially will be a synthesis, a summary of the current guidebook. The guidebook, if you were to consult it in Word form, I think it would be something like 400, if not more pages. We're trying to condense that by focusing on those core obligations that are shared across different frameworks. That way, survivors or anyone else really can access this document and find an introductory text on what states are supposed to be doing under international law to prevent and respond to CRSV. And we're, I would say, making good progress, and hopefully by the end of March, beginning of April, the document will be completed. Another way in which we're making the guidebook more accessible, as mentioned by Erin before earlier in the presentation, is revolutionizing the current website. Because as mentioned, I designed this website myself, but I'm not an IT or tech expert, as you might well imagine. So the template, what I was able to do was very limited. Still, I would say I'm still quite happy with it, but there's so many more functions to be developed in the future with the new website. I'm not going through them again, otherwise it will get repetitive. But you can look forward to that once again, end of March, beginning of April, hopefully. Anything else, Erin, that we should mention perhaps?
Maybe just to say in terms of the guidebook's accessibility, so to give one example, if you can imagine like a glossary. So if you're someone who says, okay, I'm interested in what is the situation in terms of, as Luca showed you, for example, children born of rape, that is a keyword and it will create for you the excerpts so you can kind of go through. So, but in addition to that, during the workshop, just to be clear, we will be creating training modules based on the guidebook for like thematic topics, for example, which will be sort of a more digestible type of tool. As we develop those, we hope to put them on the guidebook, or put them on the website, not in the guidebook. And maybe if we don't have any other questions, I do actually have an invitation to all of our attendees. You may have seen that Luca showed you all of the different chapters. The last chapter of the guidebook is called Further Reading. And what that is meant to be is, while I said, you know, the guidebook is descriptive, we're not pushing any particular agenda, etc. We are the Mukwege Foundation, and we do want to encourage those who are seeking to improve the current legal framework and be supportive of that. So what the Further Readings is actually a compilation of articles, journal articles, reports, blog posts, statements, etc., from NGOs, civil society, survivors themselves, and much of which, you know, makes arguments for different interpretations, broader interpretations, highlights specific issues of concern, looks at questions of CRSV from various intersectional approaches. So that is meant to be a compilation of what the title is, Further Readings. And I would invite all of the participants in your organizations, if you have any reports that you would like to have on the Further Reading chapter, please send them to us. We would be very happy to include them to amplify the work that you are doing and the priorities that you've identified.
Thank you, Erin, also for this invitation. Thank you for all your presentation. I don't see any further questions in the chat. I check with Graciela. Do you have any final question for us? Otherwise, we wrap it up. No further questions. Really thank you so much all for your time, for your effort. Also the participants, Erin and Luca, thanks so much for your beautiful work and for taking the time to present the guidebook. Graciela, many thanks for your reflections on the whole subject, and hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.
So much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.